I think that the negative does a really good job on one part of the debate, but that it doesn't really spill over to some other parts of the debate. I thought that you were actually really good on the limits argument. As a matter of fact, it's one of the best sort of articulations of that argument that I've seen people actually make in a while. I mean, I think a lot of these debates that I judge, people don't even make it through that gate, and I think that's really problematic. But I think that you need to take that. Okay, so here's the two crucial arguments that I don't think that should land, right? I think that you miss part of their argument about, like your argument is that they need to be, that a topical form of their plan, the way you conceive it, will help make them better debaters, right? But they've got sort of an internal link takeout to just like participation in the first place, right? That there's not, they won't even be able to engage in debates in the first place because there's not a series of communal norms that allow for forms of self-expression that motivate them, but also other people, and I think that's a crucial next component to debate as well, right? And I do think that they do have an answer to this sort of solipsism argument, which is sort of an empirical argument, which I do think you need to contest, which is that it inspires participation by other people who wouldn't necessarily participate. This is like their next level to me, right? And I think that that's not sufficient by all means to win, for them to win the debate for me, but I do think that gets them into a place where their argument about the distinction about the rest of their arguments in the case become important. And I think that there's a large aspect of this debate that is performative in nature that has to do with the appropriate or inappropriate use of language by particular subjects. And part of that is designed to make people uncomfortable, particularly white folk who can't use the language that they use. And I am quite uncomfortable, as you could probably see during CX, and I'm sure y'all are uncomfortable too. And I thought, quite frankly, y'all handled yourself really well because it does seem to be, a part of their strategy to, sort of throw you off in CX. And I thought that y'all performed admirably in that line, because I would have been thrown off. Just the fact that you're thrown off as well. That being said, I do think that part of their argument is precisely that the radical nature of what they say and what they're talking about, hardcore gangster rap is sort of continuously finds the line of the acceptable and unacceptable and then crosses that line in a way that makes it uncomfortable to engage in it, right, is productive. And I think that is directly analogous to some of the questions of topical versus non-topical versions of their app. Now, the next level of the debate, which I think is equally as important, where I think that if you do a good job in what I'm about to say, I think that I'm sort of much more persuaded about the limits argument, which is you haven't, I don't really know if you've actually presented a coherent reason why you need better education in this debate, right? And I think that they sort of win this uniqueness argument, right? So I think that if they create a space in debate for black folk to be more comfortable, right, to interlace their understanding of their relationship to the government and their everyday lives and their identity, that's sort of like a net benefit for them, right? And I understand that you are trying to get to the place, and I think that you get the link there, I just don't think you win the impact to it, which is that it would be nice if you could debate better on these questions. And you have some cards, but you haven't sort of pulled it all together, and I don't even know if these cards are the right cards. And I don't really know how to deal with this question because the affirmative certainly doesn't posit necessarily an educational role for you, right? And so, like, I'm just like sort of like there's nothing for you to do here, right? But I think that certainly there is, and I think that I don't know, it's something that they don't deal with, maybe they should have to deal with, but essentially they're saying that people that have more privilege, I'm comfortable saying that, even if you don't have a way to participate in this debate, if they create other forms of participation, that's fine externally. I'm really uncomfortable with that argument in the abstract, but I'm not very uncomfortable with that argument here in this debate. I think that, I mean, I think that some of your reference is probably indicative of a problem with this, which is that a lot of it speaks to sort of competition in the abstract and the game in the abstract, but relatively little of it speaks to the question of education, and education is on the question of race, racism, institutional structures of race, etc. And I think that if it's talked more about that it would be good, right? Essentially, like, why should white people participate in these conversations in a particular way, right? And I'm not really sure they're leaving you much room to participate, especially in the way I'm writing my ballot right now at the end of this round. And I would certainly be open to the argument that they should have a requirement of doing that for you, right? But I also, I mean, I think that at that point you really do need to win like a better internal link to like the game collapse argument. And I just don't really think that you're doing, I mean, it's an argument, it's out there, right? But, you know, people gonna quit, which people, why are they gonna quit, that sort of stuff, right? It's so sort of tough to sort of evaluate that argument. And I think that you have to sort of, flesh it out with a more sustained engagement with sort of some cards about the nature of pedagogy, you know, racism, institutions, etc. And then, you know, like, the card that's probably closest to that in this debate is the Crenshaw evidence. And I think that that's really getting to that place, right? But I think that that card is not quite what the impact you need it to be is, right? It could be defense for your argument, but it can't be sort of offense for you, if that makes sense. Like I said, in the abstract, I'm not comfortable with what I said debate is right now, but I don't really think that that's really relevant to the question of what happened in debate. So I think that I mean, quite frankly, I'm more than a little sympathetic to your argument that their argument that you don't have specific evidence on this is possibly a reason why you can't engage in these debates. But I'm less persuaded by the fact that, you know, the way you want to participate, you should participate, and whether or not there's an internal terms that's on the, you know, culture of debate, encouraging particular types of people from particular backgrounds to debate. I'm sure you have questions, so should go ahead.
Actually, one questions.
Yeah, you can email me. That's a very what my ballot is very frustrating. Probably for the way you're tactically thinking about the debate.
It's just basically like
every time.
I mean, I don't even like want to phrase it as that. It's just like every
West Georgia.
I think about these debates. It's just like your decision isn't. I don't think you weren't really making these arguments. It's just like where do we go from here? Like, I'm having trouble.
I mean, I certainly have suggestions, but, you know, I mean, I think that the relevant question is, you know, just frankly, like, should white people or any category of privileged people, what should their role be to negate these types of arguments, right? What should their role be in testing these types of arguments, and what can be productive about that, right? And, you know, that's certainly a relevant question, but I'm not exactly sure why it's relevant, right? And I can easily imagine a world where it's not relevant. And that seems to be weird to have a game where sometimes you don't get to play.
Yeah, my kind of concern is just like, I feel like a large part of our impact is not based off of where do we engage, but it's based off of the fact that you don't have to engage people like us into core advocates in the real world. And I think like, I
do think that you win part of this argument, but I do think that, like I said, that they win sort of the uniqueness part of this argument, which assumes that we are participating in the first place, right? That assumes that Oklahoma and that they want to participate and they feel they can participate in this space, right? And that argument is.
So my like concern with arguments like those is just like, in what way do we go about negating the way you feel? What evidence could I possibly cut that says like you shouldn't feel like this, or like?
Well, see, that's what I'm saying is that I don't think that you should. You know, I don't really think that you should frame the question to be like. I mean, I think that you can actually you can certainly advance a very strong argument that the position that they put you in structurally negating them, absent them actually sort of initiating the discussion about what your role can be as an interlocutor in a debate for you, puts you in an impossible position that is a bad structural form of politics, right? But I think that really more what we want to ask is like when we're dealing with questions of systemic racism, what is the role of various communities in dealing with those questions, right? And I think that if you can present an argument about what that role is, right? Like, I mean, the weird thing is that there are other problems because all of a sudden, like if you, so for example, if you wanted to think of it in an argument like, what's some general normal language that is critique debates, like, you have to convince elites about questions like this, right? That all of a sudden posits that you're the elites and that people should have to conform to you, right? And that puts you in an untenable position, right? And I think that it's less, I think that more it's a question of education and what we should do as educators in educational settings, right? And less about, I mean, and even it could even be a question of like movements, right, or things like that. I mean, those are the areas of literature I think that.
I understand that, but like I just don't understand why all of that education is not consistent with topic action.
Yeah,
I don't, like I really just don't get it. Maybe I'm not supposed to get it, and that's something I often have to like think about and be just like, well, fuck. But,
well, I mean, one of the things they are saying is like their AF is strategic, right? And and that's the issue we're dealing with here. Literally, their AF is structured to say that the idea that we need to de-radicalize ourselves is a prominent problem when we discuss these questions, right? And their evidence talks a lot about music and the way music is commodified, but it also does speak to political structures as well, right? And that's a powerful analogy, and it was powerfully put into play in this round. And I understand your frustration that like you're not prepared to debate it.
Well, did we not negate that? Like, do you think we have left? Because I thought all of the case arguments were just like, you have no UQ for de-radicalization. What is the threshold by which somebody becomes a radical to non-radical? Is there a bright line? The fact that they go to a federally funded school, the fact that they are here at a debate tournament, they pay the entry fee, etc. All of those prove that, why exactly, like what card or like what argument is just like
I don't
being
think,
topical
I don't
makes
think,
you de-radical?
I understand what you're saying. I actually think that maybe this is where I think the way you're approaching it is maybe the opposite, right? Which is I think that you've got the uniqueness question backwards, right? I actually think that one of your pieces of evidence is a good piece of evidence for them. It's one of the pieces of evidence on case, which is like, well, this is the way you should, actually, it's the Crenshaw evidence, and this is the way you maybe should be using it, which is that their Crenshaw evidence says that you should go into the institutions and use them against themselves, right? And that's part of what you're saying in ways that call into question them, and you should reframe that in terms of the way you do it, right? It's not just go in and use the institutions, it's call into question their legitimacy by showing how their rules are false, right? And so, like, I think that in a way, they're making that argument, but in a different way, right? Their argument is that, yes, you're right, we're here to debate, but our goal is to be radical, right? And that's good. And saying that, well, you can only be X amount of radical, right? And the problem is that when that becomes questions of race and racism, it leaves the abstract question of radicalization, and it becomes a much more concrete question about identity and how we talk about things, and the limits of language, and the limits of who can use what language. And I'm not saying that just because, I'm not saying that their argument is unbeatable, even if it's based around the distinction between two words, one of which, I still, it's not going to be able to use, right? And the point is simply that that's sort of their argument, is that distinction that you're talking about, right? And I think that you have to attack it in the other level, right? Which is like, yeah, you're right, but this is why there should be a role for us, and it should be this role, right? Because I think that as soon as you can do that, then you're there, right? Because your argument is saying what their role should be, right? And I think that you have to shift it back to thinking about what your role should be, and that's a tough burden.
I feel like that is a horrible position. Just like that gets back into all of the arguments for why topicality is narcissistic, or why framework is narcissistic, because I don't think topicality necessarily is. I just don't what sorry if I'm like really frustrated.
Well, I mean, I agree. It's okay to be frustrated. That's what we're doing here.
I mean, because
There is a certain amount of incommensurability between y'all's positions, right? It's impossible for me to draw a middle ground because there might not be a middle ground. But the second thing that I would say is that I'm not thinking of this as like individuals in debate rounds. I'm thinking about this as sort of the broader structure of debate, right? And I think this is something that they actually make a fairly effective appeal to, which is that different things will happen in different rounds, and so maybe it's okay that this thing happens in this round. And the way they specifically introduce this argument is that, I mean, they essentially say that policy debate is not unique, that you get recycled arguments over and over again, right? And you're like, well, yeah, but the reason that is, and particularly in terms of topicality in these types of debates, is because we're not prepared and we can't be prepared, right? And so then I think that that sort of comes with it. And so like, yes, I understand the question. I don't think that it's because you're being selfish. Like I don't agree with their characterization of that. I do agree with their characterization of where education is beneficial and being more important in this debate. And I also agree with you that that leaves out a very important question that must be addressed, but I don't think that happens in this debate.
So like the kind of, not to put words in your mouth, but like main offense, I think you think that they're winning is that they create a different type of participation, which is a safe space for black folks, minority folks, or non-white folks to have these discussions. But don't you think like any of our limits argument, like I don't think our limits arguments are just like limits only apply to white people or only apply to policy debate. They apply to everybody. If the topic is unlimited, then like nobody can have a discussion. I don't understand why exactly the space that they create or the participation they create, even if it has a higher minority participation rate, necessarily produces effective educational discussions, which is what they said in cross-ex was the impact.
Yeah, no, see, like I think that that's the part of the argument that you're losing, because I think that you're just like that. I think that's where you're losing the uniqueness question, right? Which is that you assume that the education they get out of debate isn't good, right? But they've made a particular appeal that is not that. I mean, I don't even think that they think that the type of education that you just appealed to is even necessary, right? Okay, so here, this is one of the ways I thought about it in the debate, right? One of your tags, like your weakness card, is like, it just leaves us with a warm, fuzzy feeling, right? Well, warm, fuzzy feelings for a lot of people are just like luxuries, but warm, fuzzy feelings for certain classes of people are life and death issues, right? Feeling comfortable in a particular space is a much more important question, right? I mean, I think that one of the things that they're communicating to me is that I wouldn't say they want a safe space, but they want an open space, and that space does. I mean, the debate was not life and death for me. The debate was good for me, but I think that the appeal they're making to me is that for some people, the mere participation in these forms of education, even if they're not maximized, are important on that level, right? And so, even if those are not ideal forms of that participation, they're necessary, and it's possible that under your model they wouldn't happen at all, even if they're not as good as they could be, right? And so, the better is the enemy of the good, right? In this situation, right? And so, like, it's, yes, even if, like, you win your argument that it's just a warm, fuzzy feeling for them, they've made an argument that for particular communities, in our community, but also in America more broadly, that warm, fuzzy feeling has a bigger impact than just, yeah, no,
how do we need this? It's just like, it's necessary for survival because I'm healthy for this. Yeah. It's like, I'm not going to boost, like obviously the...
I mean, it's not, I would step back a second and say it's not just because they say it is. I will agree that a large part of it is that they are able to engage in a form of persuasion that sort of, convinces me in a certain sense that they believe what they're saying, right? But I also do think that they appeal to a broad spectrum of perspectives in society. They have evidence on this question. They produce lyrics by other artists, right, as evidence on this question. They do appeal to sort of empirical questions that, while unevidenced, do seem like they are empirical questions, but in particular about minority participation in debate. And like, I don't think that's unevidenced, right? I don't think that it's just like, because I said so, right? I think that it's saying, and the way I feel is actually a reflection of some facts. I don't know how you deny those facts, right? I don't know how you contest them. I think that what you do have to sort of do, look, and I'll say this: I don't think that they're gonna proactively offer you, what I'm about to say. But I think that you have to figure out. You have to force the issue, right? You have to say, well, what can I do here? Like, how can I negate you in a way that I'm not always behind the 8 ball on that question, just because you're ready and I'm not.
It's the weirdest thing is just like every decision we have, it's just like, did that last year and then you got told, don't ever ask those questions. Because then it just makes it seem narcissistic and like you're only appealing to yourself. Now it's just like, oh, we are supposed to have that role. And so like, it seems like I have to give like 3 2-and-R's to just like keep up with what's going on in the team.
I mean, that's also possible true that it's impossible to slice this pie for all judges, which is particularly difficult and makes your job as preparing for negative particularly difficult. But that's also a problem that exists, right? Like,
sure,
you can't convince me in one way and convince the judge in another way. You've got to convince us in some way.
I understand.
I think that it's okay to ask those questions if you can back it up with a proposal for what would be good and why they negate that, right? I'm thinking in very concrete terms, right? And the way you want to think about it is you've already sort of done research on questions of, strategies for social justice, the way people can actually engage institutions and things like that, right? And I think that, if we're talking about the question of who gets included how, right? Even if you go back to things like abolitionism, if you go back to things like the civil rights movement, this is an important foundational question, which is A, are white people necessary? And B, how do you get them to engage in that movement, right? And if you can say the A part and the B part, and say, how can you both, and then explain to me why the model that they presented prevents that, I think that that's an effective form of argumentation, right? Because you're not appealing to yourself, you're appealing to what it is. And like I said, I think that you're winning one part of it, right? And I think that if you do the next thing, right, they're never going to give it to you yet, right? They're never going to say you could do this, right? But you can set up a model and make them answer it, right?
Sure, I understand. It's just like, I don't know, it's like, it seems like we have to do a lot of the work to win this toward the link, and then you're asking us to do basically an entirely separate criticism argument, which honestly already investigated it a little bit, but basically can be summed up as what's the room for Whitey, which obviously isn't a position that's I think it's a position that has a lot of evidence about it, but I don't think it's that
a good debate argument,
persuasive. No, it's obviously.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to do. Right.
Okay.
I don't know how to answer that question. I just know that I haven't been convinced in this debate that that's not the question.
Sure. Okay. I've already come. Thanks. I'll probably.
Yeah. Y'all got questions?
Just round.
Yo,
Start right after this.
I don't really have is it any way that I can extend this code switching argument better to you? Because I feel like you the first judge and took our verses and fucking
Well, you told me to, right?
tell everybody to, but they don't care about this shit.
I don't know. You got it. Well, so at the end when I asked you for all the evidence, you just handed me the evidence.
That blew my mind though.
So
You said,
you say
oh, here you go, man.
Sometimes you gotta just hand people the evidence. When you hand them the lyrics, they'll be like, oh, that's the evidence too, right? You're making that argument, so you just gotta force that issue a little bit, probably. I don't know. I didn't really take a lot of convincing on the code switching argument. It seems like, yeah, there's multiple forms of evidence. That's an important argument for you to make, because I think that you do need to have me be interpreting those things as the critic at the back of the room, right? As sort of responses to, well, you dropped this, you dropped that, right? Or you don't have evidence on this question, you don't have evidence on that question, right? is there another way that you can put it into operation in this debate?
More developed.
Yeah. I mean,
Not that I can think of right now. I'm sure there is. I mean, I think that actually probably, I mean, just as like a general suggestion, I don't really think that was like the place where you needed to adjust the most in this debate.
Yeah.
I think it was probably some of the continuous.
oh yeah, I know. It wasn't the place.
Just like the topical version stuff, like you should spend more time on that stuff, right? Because that's the heart of their argument, right? If they can't, if you convince me on that question, on that there's no topical version, which in more than a couple senses in this debate you do, right? But the more you can convince me on that question, the less they have defense to your app, right? I mean, because like the topical version of your app argument is a counterclaim.
Yeah.
And if the
That's
more
that's
solid,
what I was trying to say in one of your like, so if you think about the shit about legal shit, you could have read that legal shit in this debate.
yeah, well, yeah, that's a good argument. Yeah, I think that you can make that argument.
Not that persuasive though, I'm assuming.
I don't know. Can they make that argument? Maybe they can make that argument. I mean, what if they just would have gotten up and said, you should take this to the government and ask them. If you, I mean,
Yeah, to me, but to me, there'll be a methodology debate. I guess that's kind of what, you know what I'm saying, T is trying to get to. But I feel like if we went all in, like, no, I think the better way is to go to the government, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But I feel like, I guess it's kind of what T is, maybe a little bit. I don't know.
I interpret that as what framework is. Like,
Yeah.
framework is
Yeah,
like
to me,
it all has to be
to me, with my years of debate, you know, T and framework is like apples and apple juice. You feel me? That shit is the same thing substantively. You feel me?
Yeah.
You
No.
telling me I did something wrong and I should have did it this way, whether it was resolutional or whether it was like based off my style. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think that I can actually be persuaded actually that those are not the same thing, right? Which is why I think that you're winning your